Okay, so welcome back. This is part 6 in our series, our playlist, where we show you how to develop this application you see here. This is a C# Visual Studio Windows Forms application. So what is this application doing? Well, it's allowing you to simulate the real-world electric power system that feeds your home, your office, your city, your state. And you can see here we've got a generator, we've got some power lines, we've got some substations, and it's all connected into an electrical network, and this application allows you to simulate that as they do in the real world. Many industries simulate connecting together electrical network and look at what the voltages are and the power flows and the current flows and so on. So this application allows you to take data on all of these pieces of equipment and generate a network and solve the network electrically to see what the results are. So I encourage you to look at the previous videos where we developed the core of this application, which allows you to input data and connect it all together and then solve for the resulting power flows and voltages like you see here in this diagram. Now previously what we did is we took some input data as you see here, and this is a text file, what's called a comma separated value CSV file. And that text file described the different pieces of equipment and their properties. And you can see here we've got, for example, on each line of this text file, we've got bus data, which describes a real-world piece of equipment and its properties. And we've got 5 buses, each with different properties. And then we've got 5 loads, each with different properties, 2 generators with properties. And this application allows us to read in each line as an object, a class object, and automatically map those properties. So we have all of these real-world objects, and we tie them together into a network and solve for the results. So what we had existing with this application is the ability to have a CSV text file describing the data. What we're going to do in this video is we're going to also allow you, instead of using just a CSV text file, we're going to allow you to input the exact same data in a SQLite database format. Now in the future what we're going to do is we're going to improve on this application in other ways. One of them is that this basically read in a fixed network configuration described in this text file. What we're going to do is we're going to provide the ability to, in real time, change the parameters of each of these pieces of equipment. For example, we can take things in and out of service. We're also going to show how to, instead of having this diagram called a one-line diagram of the network, we're going to allow you to have what's called a dynamic one-line that changes based on what the network configuration is that you read in from your CSV or your database file. And also as you make changes, it's going to change that diagram. So that's going to be in future videos. But in this video, we're going to show you how to read in a SQLite database with the exact same information. So one of the wonderful features about this application we start out with, when reading our CSV file, as I mentioned, we could take each line of the CSV file and directly map it to a corresponding class, like a bus class or a load class or a generator class. And we did that using a wonderful library called CSV Helper. And you basically tell it, okay, take this line, map all of the properties and instantiate a new, in this case, a bus class, fill out all the properties, and then you can put all of those into an array, and then you can operate on them. And thankfully, we can do the same thing when we're working with a SQLite database. We're going to use a library called Dapper, and it will basically do exactly the same thing. It will take each line in our tables, rather than in our CSV file, each line in our table and map it to a class object. Then all we have to do is take those class objects and do exactly what we did with the CSV Helper class objects. And we're going to maintain a system array class that has all of the equipment in these arrays that we can then work on. So here is a diagram of the basic layout, especially of the front end of our application. The core is going to be the system arrays class. and it's going to store all of the information of all of the network objects, all the equipment, and no matter where it comes from, it's all going to be maintained in this system arrays class. And once we have that, we can modify it. For example, if we decide we do a solution, we want to modify it, we can do a UI update, and we go into this exact same system arrays class and we can modify it. And then when we read in a CSV or a database file, no matter how they operate to get the data, it's still going to modify and populate the same data in the system arrays class. That kind of gives us a front end that is separate from the actual solution. Once we have all those arrays, no matter how we got them, then we can solve it and go through the solution process. But this is a real nice layout because we can change it, we can do whatever we want, and it all comes down to this system arrays class. So here we are in our C# Visual Studio Windows Forms application. Now we've developed the core of this application previously in this series, so I encourage you to take a look at it. In this video, we are going to focus on this Open File button. Now what does the Open File button do? Well, previously we had it configured so we can open a comma-separated value CSV file that describes the network we want to solve. And each line represents a class object, like a bus object or a load object, and we use CSV helper to map those lines to corresponding class objects. And in our application, we've got a bus class, we've got generator class, we've got line class. So we already did that. Now in this video, we're going to use the same Open File button to instead open a SQLite database file. As you see here, we talked previously about using DB Browser for SQLite. You can either generate a database or you can import a CSV to create a database. And then we've got the exact same data. We got the buses and all the properties. And in this video, we're going to show you how to use that Open File button to go out and read a selected database file. And again, like we did before, map each line of that database file as a class object, a bus object, a generator, a line object, or whatever. And then we can take arrays of those objects and do a solution. So in this video, we're going to assume we've got two separate SQLite database objects. You can have 20 if you want, but we're going to have a couple different ones that we can select from. So here's our main form one, and there's not a lot to it. We've got docs to do, parameters, we got some initializing stuff, some methods, and event handlers. Now, as I said, we're going to focus on that open button event handler to allow us to open a SQLite database. So let's look at the event handler, and we've got the open button, the solve button, the exit. So the open button is very simple. It is going to either open the CSV file and populate our arrays, or it's going to open our .db files. So we've got a Boolean here that I define up here as CSV in. I initialize it to false. All that means is we want to read in a CSV file. If not, we want to read in a database file. If CSV in is true, we're going to do an open file dialog to get the name of the file the user wants to bring in, the CSV file, and then pass that to a CSV reader method. And we talked about that previously. We'll talk about it in the future. But if not, we're going to do this SQLite reader method that we're going to generate. And we're going to pass it what I call a database name tag, and we'll talk about that. But it's just giving us an indication which of these files we want to open. So we're going to have this method that we're going to focus on, and it is in the file processor class. So up here you can see I've got a bunch of different classes. Most of these are to represent an object of each type of equipment, like a transformer, shunt, load. But we've also got two other very important classes. One is a file processor class, which does all the work when we decide if we want a CSV or a database file. This does all of the loading and parsing of all of the data in either of those two types of files. And then it takes that data and puts them into the system arrays class. And these are the arrays that we're going to need to solve our network, to do a network solution. So no matter how we do it, they're all going to go into this single system arrays class with all of the data. So what we're going to do is we're going to focus on this file processor class, and specifically these two methods. SQLite reader, where we feed it a name tag that we'll talk about, and then load connection string. We're going to need, in order to talk to the database, we're going to need what's called a connection string, and that string is going to tell us which of these two files we want to open. So the first thing we're going to have to, in order to do SQLite and to map the SQLite database data directly to our class objects like we did with the CSV, we're going to also have to download Dapper. So we've got two things to download, Dapper and a library for our SQLite. So first thing we're going to do is go to Tools, NuGet Package Manager, Manage NuGet Packages for Solutions, and we're going to browse to Dapper, and you can see here Dapper, 274 million downloads, very popular. I'm going to assume you know how to download and install that. Just select it and hit download. The other is going to be system.data.SQLite, and we're going to download the systemdata.SQLite.core, 35 million downloads, and again just select that and download and install. And those are the only two libraries we're going to need to install. Now, one other thing we're going to have to configure in terms of references, we're going to have to go to References, select that, right-click, Add Reference, and go down to System.Configuration and make sure that box is checked. And then we should be all set to go. So now that we've got the libraries and everything, the first thing we're going to have to do is we're going to have to set up a connection string that will allow our C# application to talk to whatever database we decide to load in. To do that, we're going to go to our project, and here you're going to see app.config, so double click on that, and we're only going to load these 4 lines. Under configuration, we're going to add this connection strings in brackets. And since we have 2 database files that we want to access, I've got 2 lines here that reference both of those database files. So you can see here I've got my Fuad 9bus.db and then Stevenson 5bus.db. So we've got connection strings, and we're going to do add name, and we're going to do what I call a database name tag. And all that is a string, a name string that will allow you to reference this database using this, what's called a connection string. And it's kind of a name tag we can use in our software to identify the database we want to load. So the Fuad9bus.db, I'm just going to call that Fuad. I'm going to give that name tag. Same thing with the Stevenson. We've got a Stevenson 5bus. I'm just going to call it Stevenson. So what I can do in my application, just reference those names, either of those names, and it will automatically connect to the right database. So we do the add name and then connection string equal, and we're going to use this string, which is the connection string. We define the data source. In my case, I'm putting the directory where I'm locating these. Data source is d:/documents loadflow.db, and then the name of the database, fuad9bus.db with a colon, and version 3, colon, and end of quote. And then we have to add provider name equals system.data.SQL client with end of quotes, and then / and end bracket. Same thing with every database. Now you can just add to these if you want, add additional lines using a different file name and different name tag. But at the end of that, you just do the end connection strings, and that's it. So at this point, we've downloaded libraries, we set up the app.config, and now we should be able to access our database. So if we don't want CSV in, we're going to go here, and we're going to call the SQLite reader inside the file processor class, and we're going to feed it the DB database name tag. And in my case, I've set up a string DB name tag is Stevenson, and that's going to directly reference that app.config line. So we're feeding it the name Stevenson into the SQLite reader, and let's go into that file processor method to see what's going on. So here's the SQLite reader, and we're going to reference this load connection string with that same name tag, and we're going to default it to Stevenson, but we're going to talk about this load connection string also. But the first thing is we're going to feed that name tag into SQLite Reader. Again, this assumes a systemdata.sqlite.core and Dapper have been installed. A reference to system configuration has been included, and the SQLite connection string has been added to the app.config or multiple connection strings. So the first thing we're going to do is using IDB connection, and we're going to call it con, is a new SQLite connection. And then we're going to reference the load connection string method we just saw, and we're going to pass it that name tag. So this is going to return the connection string from our app.config and use that to generate a new IDB connection. As long as we have this using statement, we're going to use that connection. When we're done with this bracket, we're going to close that connection automatically. Now, what this is going to do is it's going to use Dapper to query the IDB connection database. Note that there is no need to specifically open the SQLite connection, since Dapper will automatically check the state of the connection and open it if necessary. So just keep that in mind. We're not going to have any statement here that says connection.open. We don't need it because this is going to be taken care of by Dapper. So the first thing we're going to do, again, we've got these case ID generators, buses, tables inside our database file. And what we're going to do is we're going to map each of those to the corresponding class. And to do that, we're going to say var output case ID, and this is going to give us an IEnumerable coming out of Dapper. And later we're going to convert that to a list that we can work with. But output case ID, we're going to do connection.query. And in these brackets, we're going to use the case ID object and select all from the case ID table and new dynamic parameters. So this is basically doing a SQL query from the case ID table, and it is returning a enumerable of all of the case ID objects and populating them. So very similar to CSV helper. So once we have that, we can now say we can convert that IEnumerable to a list, and we're going to have a list of case ID called case ID. And we have defined in the properties those lists. And those are kind of interim lists that are getting the results of our queries, and ultimately we're going to convert those into the system collections arrays, because we need arrays to do the solution. So output case ID to list, we're going to call it case ID, and that's going to be a list of case ID. And all we have to do is do the exact same thing for each of the other tables. Select all from the buses table, assign it to an IEnumerable, which we then convert to a list called buses. And the same thing for the loads and the shunts and the generators and the lines and the transformer. So after this, we have populated all of our internal lists of those objects. We've got all the lists, and now we're taking all of those lists, converting them to array, and we're calling them system_arrays.bus, load, shunt, gen line, so on. We're also populating some of the other parameters in the system arrays class, number of buses, loads, shunts, and so on. But basically, that's all we need to do in order to map our databases to our system arrays for each of the types of object. Now, let's take a look at this load connection string. Basically, all we do is we're feeding it the app.config name tag, and we're defaulting to Stevenson. But all it does is it takes that and does a configuration manager, which is why we added the reference to system.configuration. Configuration manager.connection strings ID, and it passes that name tag .connection string. So this is how you get the connection string from app.config to use it in your application. So really pretty straightforward. The SQLite and Dapper working together makes it really easy to map those objects in the tables to our system arrays objects. Now, just keep in mind, you don't always need to do, in this case we're using Dapper to query the tables, you don't need to convert those to class objects. It's nice, but you can just do a simple query. And what I've got down here, these two lines, are a simple query to get a list. Say we just want to know the names of all the tables in that database. You can do a simple query to return a IEnumerable of table names. So we can say connection.query. In this case, we want the strings, and we're going to use a SQL query that says select name from SQLite schema, which defines the schema of the database, where type equals table. And that's going to return to us an IEnumerable of strings that define the table names. So now we've got a IEnumerable of table names, and all we have to do is convert that to a list, and we can assign that to our system arrays table names, and that'll just be a list of all the table names in our database. And when we run it, you can see that we will open file, and it will automatically list out tables, buses, all of the tables in that database. So you can do simple queries. You don't have to do object mapping. Now with Dapper, you are going to need to do SQL queries as we showed. But previously we talked about this DB browser for SQLite. And one of the wonderful features is you can try out, if you're going to do SQL queries, you can try them out in DB browser and see what the results are. So for example, I put in the select name from SQLite _ schema where type equals table, and you just hit the run button and it will give you the results. It's kind of like a dictionary with a index and a name for all of the values. So that's about it for this one. In the next video, we'll probably take a look at some other features. We're trying to get this application where we can, in real time, make changes to the parameters of this network and resolve. And then we're also going to be looking at updating this, what's called a one-line diagram for any different database we decide to import. We're going to have its own different one-line diagram showing the results. So if you like any of these videos, I encourage you to hit the like button, subscribe, hit the bell notifications, but most of all, please let others know that we're here so we get some views. Really appreciate it. Otherwise, take care. Have a really good day. Thanks.